All right. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're happy to have Jean Keener here to talk about planning for your retirement. Please post any questions you have for her in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the program. Jean started KFP after a 10-plus year career in business management. As a career changer, she went back to school and completed the Certified Financial Planner Educational Program through the University of North Texas Professional Development Institute. After passing her CFP exam, she joined the Garrett Planning Network and began serving financial planning clients full-time. She has been doing financial planning for over 10 years. Outside of work, she is married and co-parents two rambunctious lab mixes, Maya and Tanner. She enjoys cooking, visiting diner, drive-ins, and dives restaurants, and spending time outdoors. So Jean, thanks for doing this today. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I will come back at the end of the program.
Thank you, Jennifer. It is great to be here. And I want to just thank everyone who's joined the call for sharing your lunch hour with me. I know that COVID has made all of us much more kind of keenly aware of our finances and just kind of the need to prepare for the unexpected and the expected, like retirement. And so hopefully we can get some of these important questions answered today. So financial planners work with clients on a broad range of issues, including retirement planning. And so today I'd really like to share some thoughts about the changes retirement brings to our lives and talk about some of the things that are on your mind on this topic. I do want to let you know that we have a very broad range of people attending this call. People that may still be early in what we call the accumulation phase, when you're trying to save up your money to get ready for retirement. So people that may be in their 20s or 30s or 40s. And then we also have people that are getting really close to retirement or even in retirement. And so I'm going to try and cover the whole gamut. And certainly if you have questions that are more specific to one of those phases, we can dig into those at the end and we'll save some time for questions. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And so we'll talk first about just some of the more personal aspects of retirement, and then we'll get to the nitty-gritty financial stuff. And so first, it's really a time of change, right? So it's not going to work every day is kind of the big thing that most of us think about. But there are also other changes. And so you want to think about where you're going to live, whether you might continue to do some kind of work, just different kinds, and what you'll do with your free time. And on the financial side, really getting a handle on what your living costs are and what sources of income you can count on are the most important things. And then the really critical question that we all have is, will your savings last as long as you need it? And so to help make sure the answer is yes, we're going to talk about some financial basics and explore several of the key tools you should use to accumulate what you'll need. And so one of the most important things we can do is to think about what we're going to do with our time in retirement. And so we've got a list on the screen here of some of the most common things that people think they may want to pursue in retirement. The discussion I've had with many clients has really revolved around, we have some clients who are so eager to leave the workforce that they don't even think about what they're going to do once they are retired. And we have other clients who are really retiring to something instead of going from something. And the people who are going to retire to something generally find the transition to retirement much easier and less stressful. And so as you look at this list of things, and you may have many other things that you're considering as well. I know one of the most common things that didn't even make this list that I hear people say is they want to help take care of their grandkids. That's a really common thing. But we found that if you create a grid for yourself and you put morning, afternoon, and evening across the top, and along the left side, you put each day of the week, and you just pencil in what you plan to do in each of those time slots, it can really create a very good just guide to let you know, hey, yes, I have a really rich, full plan for everything I want to do in retirement. Or, there are some additional explorations that I need to do here to make sure that I'm you're not just going to sit on the couch and get bored. And so I know we had one client that said, well, I just want to play golf all the time. And when he actually did that chart, he realized, you can only play golf so much, as fun as it is. And so it challenged him to go out and develop some additional things that he was interested in. So that was very helpful. So the next piece we want to talk about is that people that are retiring today or retiring in the next 10 years or 20 years, it's going to look different financially than it did for your parents. And so your reliance on your personal savings and your investments is probably going to be higher. There are also fewer pensions. Now, if you are, with the city, you have certainly access to a great pension, which is great. There are also potential Social Security changes. And many people who are retiring today tend to keep doing some part-time work longer. And then the last thing in here is really the kicker, is we have longer life expectancy. And so for someone at 65 today, their life expectancy is 84 years. And so a man retiring at 65 can expect to live 18 years and a woman 20 years. And so that's just more years that we need to be prepared to help fund retirement. And we all know the numbers I just gave you are averages. And so what is really more meaningful is to know what your family history is, to know what your health is. And you may need to plan for far longer than 84, 85. You may need to plan into your 90s or even 100. And so then the financial responsibilities of that longer potential longevity become much more significant. So let's talk about the work option, because this is something that there's hardly any downside to continuing to work in retirement. Many times you're able to find something that's more flexible. Perhaps it's something different that you it's a passion you've always wanted to pursue. It also can be maybe the same thing that you're doing right now, just with more flexibility. If you come back and do consulting, or go work for a different employer that kind of needs your area of expertise. And so the option to continue working can have real financial benefits. It can also bring a lot of great satisfaction. One thing I do want to just emphasize, if you are one of the people that is planning to continue working into the early part of retirement, is you do want to keep Social Security income limits in mind. If you have taken Social Security before your full retirement age, then you can't earn more than about $17,000 a year before your Social Security starts to be reduced. And so right now, people that were born between 1943 and 1954, their full retirement age is 66. And so after 66, they can earn as much as they want with no restrictions, and it doesn't affect Social Security. But before 66, they do need to be cognizant of that limit. So let's talk about getting into more of the purely financial side and talk about how to estimate your retirement costs. And so there are some areas where you may have lower expenses. And so you may have fewer or no job-related costs. Your mortgage may be paid off, but I just want to say on this, even if it's not, that's usually okay. So kind of in our culture, we have this idea that, I need to have a paid for house at retirement or else there's no way it's going to work. And so we've had many clients go into retirement with the mortgage. And I think the reason it's really different today than it was perhaps for your parents is that interest rates are so low. And so because interest rates are low, sometimes keeping that mortgage is actually the best thing. And you just take money out of your investments a little bit more gradually over time to pay it down. So I wanted to kind of just take that worry off your mind if it was something that was concerning to you. And then the third bullet here is that children are often grown, sometimes financially independent, not always, but that is definitely a huge cost reduction as you get your children launched, that you will have lower costs in that area. There are some areas though where expenses can be more. And so it's just something to think about. Sometimes healthcare costs can be higher. Your home maintenance, if your home is aging, can start to add up. And of course, our property taxes, even though you get the age 65 exemption, property taxes are still a really significant portion of our budgeting for most of us. And then the other element here is that if your time has been spent working and now you envision doing more things with your free time, some of those things may cost money. And so thinking about the extra costs that can come with that. And so on the slide here, we talk about an estimate of 75% to 100% of pre-retirement income. And that's a really broad estimate, right? Not super helpful. And so if we just kind of put that in real dollars, if your current annual income was $65,000 pre-retirement, if you needed to be at 75%, that'd work out to about $48,000 a year. If you needed to be at 90%, that'd be $58,000 a year. But in my experience, these percentages haven't been super helpful. So the thing that I really recommend is, and I've had a client tell me this, so he had used a percentage when he came in and he said, I need this much money for my retirement budget. And so after he had been retired for a couple of years, he said, here's what I wish I had done. He said, I wish I would have gone into my bank and credit card statements and exported all of my transactions for a year and used that as my baseline for my retirement spending. And so the method I recommend is actually doing just that now. And so there are a few modifications you'll want to make to this export. You'll want to delete things that are transfers, right? If you're transferring money like to pay a credit card bill, you don't want to double count that. So delete the transfers. You'll also want to delete things that are stopping, like work-related commuting expenses. If you go out for lunch every day at work, but you're going to stop that in retirement, or if you have child-related expenses that are ending. So delete those things. And then you want to add the new expenses. So that could be the increased travel. It could be costs of volunteering. It could be if you're starting a business startup costs, or a new hobby. A mistake, though, that people often make when they do this process is they delete the one-off things. And we all know what those are. It's when you need to put new tires on your car, or an appliance breaks, and so you've got to replace it. If you've got some medical out-of-pocket costs one year that normally don't occur, or insurance deductibles. And so it can be really tempting to delete that kind of thing as you're looking at your retirement budget, but I would encourage you not to. Leave that kind of stuff in, because the same thing doesn't happen every year, but pretty much something always does happen. And so by leaving just kind of an extra buffer in your budget for those things that come up, it really prepares you to be able to handle those things and not feel like it's a big financial stressor when it occurs. So let's go on and let's talk about sources of income. And so estimating the income we'll need is just the first step. The bigger issue is, of course, where the money will come from. And so the sources of income that you want to think about are withdrawals from your investments, both retirement and non-retirement assets. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Social Security and pensions. And then I have single premium immediate annuities on here. And so that is a specific type of annuity that you don't contribute to as you're saving up your money for retirement. But it can be a valuable tool at retirement to purchase one of these. And it gives you a guaranteed stream of income for life. Generally, the people that this is most appropriate for are people that don't have a pension, where they don't have any other guaranteed income other than Social Security. And so purchasing one of these annuities can be helpful. I will tell you that right now, interest rates are very low. So oftentimes when we run the numbers on these, they're not super attractive and we don't recommend them. But they can still be helpful in certain situations. And that's why I wanted you to be aware that they were an option that was out there. Rental income can also be another source if you've acquired rental properties, especially if you get them paid off prior to retirement. You can get some very good income from that. And then, of course, we've already talked about part-time work. So the key thing is that your approach is going to change over time. And so this chart shows you some of the things you want to be thinking about at various ages. And so you start out in your 20s and 30s. And with your investment portfolio, you can afford to be very aggressive. Doesn't mean you have to be. If it's making you nervous and you're losing sleep over seeing your investment balances go up and down, then you don't have to do that. You can be more conservative and it's still okay. But if you're comfortable with knowing that it's long-term, being aggressive can really help you accumulate wealth more quickly. The general guideline in your 20s and 30s is to save at least 10% of your income. And you'll notice on the chart actually uses the word invest. And that's actually a good differentiator, because if you just put money into savings that you're maybe saving to spend, to go on a vacation or to send your kid to college or to buy your next car, that's great too. But it's not money that you're really setting aside for retirement. So you want to invest at least 10% of your income towards retirement. And then you want to have a general idea of what your long-term plan is, like how you're going to accumulate enough money for retirement. And then the last item here is to make an estate plan. And so an estate plan is kind of a fancy word for getting a will. And the reason it gets called an estate plan is because it's not just the will that you need. You also want to have a general durable power of attorney and your medical documents. For people that have kids, getting the estate plan is super important because you name guardians for your children if something happens to you. But even for the rest of us, it's still a really good idea to go ahead and get this in place. And a lot of times when you're younger, you feel like you don't need it. But, if COVID has taught any of us anything, it's that the unexpected can certainly happen. And so it's so much better. It's a real gift to your loved ones to have these documents in place. It just makes their lives much easier if they're already having to deal with this incredibly difficult situation. And then in your 40s, you'll notice we still say be aggressive. And then you'll notice that we're also saying you want to try to start increasing your savings. That can be challenging because the 40s, you oftentimes have a lot of competing goals. You may be sending kids to college. You may be caring for aging parents. Your career has usually been advancing. You're probably earning more money. This is a general guideline for you. It may not be right, but if you can invest up to 15% of income, that really does help prepare you for getting closer to retirement and having more accumulated when you need it. And then in your 50s, you want to start being more cognizant of the risk in your investment portfolio. And so you'll notice it says be a little more cautious. It doesn't mean that you need to get out of all stock altogether, but it is just a good time to, if you've been at a high stock allocation, to just start dialing it back a little bit. And you'll notice we are suggesting on here to invest an even higher percentage of your income if possible. In your 50s, you also get access to the catch-up contribution. And so that lets you do more on a tax-deferred basis. And then sometimes people start to receive inheritances from family members as they get into their 50s and 60s. And so, that is usually something unexpected. And it's something you want to make sure you put it to best use. And so investing it for your retirement is a really good way to do that. And then the other thing that you want to consider in your 50s is starting to think about long-term care. And so insurance is certainly one solution. It doesn't have to be the only one. We have many clients who opt to do what we call self-insuring, which means that you basically just put an invisible earmark on part of your investment assets and say, if I do need care, this is what I'm going to use. And the benefit of the self-insuring method is that if you don't need the care, your assets can be passed on to kids or other, things that are important to you. If you do need the care, the money is available to you. It is a little bit more risky. Insurance will generally provide you with greater coverage, but it can oftentimes be a really preferred option for many people. And so it's just something I want you to be aware of. The most important thing is to think about how you'll pay for it. Doesn't mean that there's one solution for everyone. We just don't want you to completely ignore it. Focusing on and having a plan is important. And then in your 60s, this is when we put, most people retiring. Of course, you may retire earlier or later, perfectly fine. So you want to generally think about your investment portfolio as a V shape. And so the 20s and 30s, you're super aggressive. And then you actually want to get more conservative and be most conservative at retirement. And so if you're retiring in your 60s, that would be the time you were most conservative in your investment allocation. And then as you get into retirement and you've made it past those early years where your spending is probably the highest, your portfolio withdrawal rate is probably the highest, you can actually start ramping your portfolio allocation to stock back up. And so that's how we get the V shape, is that you start high, come down low, and then gradually ramp back up. And of course, many times people don't really want to ramp back up. They're like, I just don't want to deal with all that fluctuation. That's okay. But if you're looking for how to optimize your financial, your wealth and what you can possibly pass on, that V shape does give you more power with your finances to do that. I do want to emphasize the continuing to own some stock. That sometimes there's the misconception that you want to go into an all bond portfolio at retirement, and that is just not the case. You think about what bonds are paying right now. Interest rates are so low, and so you would have to dramatically cut your spending if you wanted to have an all bond portfolio. And so we like that combination of stocks and bonds to enable you to keep up with inflation and to have something that is more secure and less volatile than stocks with bonds. So you want to have some of both. And then we want to remind you in your 60s to update your estate plan. And so, this is something, if you put something in place early on, your life has most certainly changed. And so you want to come back and make sure that it's up to date. Okay, so let's go ahead. That should be enough to keep you busy, right? Let's go ahead and talk about how to build retirement savings. And so, we've got 5 big boxes on here. Employer-sponsored plans are things like 401k plans, 403b plans. If you're a city employee, you have access to the 457 plan. And so those are usually a very efficient way to save, because you put it on autopilot. You just have it taken out of your pay. You forget about it. You get tax benefits, which are great. And then sometimes you even get employer matching. And so all of those combined really make it our first stop as a financial planner to make sure we're fully utilizing all the benefits of an employer retirement plan. The next, and people often ask how much they can put into these. So this year, the limit, if you're under 50, is $19,500 per year. If you are 50 or older, even if you turn 50 on December 31st, you can put an extra $6,500 in there. And so that's a really, it works out to $26,000 a year, a really nice amount of money that can add up very quickly. And you certainly always want to do enough to get any employer matching. The next thing we have here is an IRA. And so there are 2 types of IRAs, traditional and Roth IRAs. And you can put money into these whether or not you're participating in an employer plan. And so this year you can put up to $6,000 into your IRA. And then if you're 50 or older, another $1,000 catch up. And so sometimes there's the misconception that if you're not working and don't have any earned income, that you can't contribute to an IRA. But if you have a spouse who has earned income, you can contribute based on their income. And so that is something to be aware of, that even a non-working spouse can accumulate IRA assets. So one thing about these is, I mentioned there are 2 types of IRAs, traditional and Roth. And so the traditional IRA may or may not be deductible for you. And so if you are not eligible to deduct it, then we actually don't recommend doing it. We actually recommend only doing the traditional IRA if you get to deduct that contribution. And the reason for that is it's actually more tax efficient to do this taxable investment portfolio. You get better treatment on your earnings. And the money going in has exactly the same tax treatment. If it's not deductible in the traditional IRA, you're going to see exactly the same thing here. But your earnings get taxed at capital gain rates rather than regular income rates, which is what the non-deductible traditional IRA gets taxed as. And then this box right here is really focused on self-employed individuals. And so you have lots of great options if you're self-employed to save for retirement. In some cases, you can actually put away far more than someone who is working for a corporation or a government entity. And so you can do a SEP IRA, which is an abbreviation for Simplified Employee Pension. You can do a simple IRA or even an individual 401k plan. And you can also you do things on a tax deferred basis, or the solo 401k lets you do things on a Roth basis. And we haven't really touched on Roth yet, but Roth lets you put money in after tax and all the earnings are tax free. And so it is a huge benefit. And there are no income limits to doing Roth contributions into a solo 401k, or if your employer offers a Roth option in the employer-sponsored plan. If you want to do a Roth IRA, there are income limits. And so you want to just be aware of those and make sure you're eligible before you put money in. On this slide, we also list annuities, fixed and variable. And I will just tell you that we don't generally recommend them for accumulation. The reason is that they have higher costs, which hurt growth, and you also lose flexibility with the assets. Usually doing some combination of these other categories are going to be better. Now, there are some exceptions. Sometimes there are reasons for liability protection that you might want to consider this. But for the most part, I'd like you to think really long and hard before you go into an annuity for accumulation purposes, for the issues that I suggested. And then we'll talk a little bit more about taxable investment portfolios before we leave this slide. So a lot of times people feel like if they're already maxing out their employer's sponsored retirement plans, that's really all they can do. And that's really not true. So a taxable investment portfolio is available to you no matter what your income is, no matter how much you're putting into any other account, and there are no limits on it. So if you want to save 50% of your income into a taxable investment account, you can do it. And we really like them because they give you a lot of flexibility with retirement planning. And because you can take the money back out before you get to age 59 and a half, which is gives you, if something comes up with, you need a down payment on a home, or you just have an unexpected need for money in addition to your emergency fund, that taxable investment account is available to you. So there are a lot of reasons to like that account. And then something that didn't make this chart, which I think is just good to be aware of, is a health savings account. And so we think of a health savings account as a way to pay for our current medical expenses, but actually they can be used as a very effective retirement savings vehicle. So they are the only part of the tax code where you put the money in and you get a tax break. And you can also take the money out tax-free as long as it's used for healthcare expenses. And it's not just the contributions that you can take out tax-free, it's also all the earnings along the way. And so it becomes essentially very much like a Roth IRA where you get all this tax-free growth, except for you also got a tax deduction on the front end when you put the money in. So to be eligible for an HSA, you have to have a high deductible health plan. And you have to not have any other health insurance that is not high deductible. So you can't do it once you're on Medicare, for example. And then you want to make sure to differentiate between an HSA and an FSA. So an FSA is a flexible spending account, and those are use it or lose it. So if you don't use the full amount each year, it's gone. The HSA, you put the money in and it stays yours. It can grow year after year after year, and you never lose it. And you can then use it for funding your healthcare costs in retirement. And so we really like the HSA a lot. The key part is to get the money to grow. You can't spend it on your healthcare expenses while you're working. You need to pay for any out-of-pocket healthcare expenses you have just from your regular income. And so for some people, things are a little too tight to do that. But if you can arrange your finances in a way that you have the flexibility to do that, it can be a very powerful tool. Okay, so let's talk about how to make the most of your employer's retirement plan. So number one, you may laugh about, and that's just to participate. We'll start with the obvious, right? And the next thing is to contribute as much as you can. And for sure enough to get any matching. And then we also want you to diversify among plan choices. And a really common mistake I see in this area is people look at what the returns are for the different funds over the last 10 years. And they pick the ones that have the highest returns, which seems like a good thing to do. But what that usually leads you to is picking maybe 3 or 4 funds that are all from the same asset class, because large cap US stocks have done really, really well over the last decade. You may end up with 3 or 4 large cap US stocks if you go with this method of picking the ones with the highest 10-year performance. And so you're really not diversified. You just bought the same thing, slightly different flavors of the same thing. You bought, different flavors of ice cream, but it's all still ice cream 3 or 4 times. And so we really want to make sure you pick and from each of the different asset classes. So you want to make sure you get 1 US stock fund, 1 international stock fund, 1 bond fund. Those are kind of the 3 basics that you start out with first. And then you can add in some additional diversification with other types of bonds, or maybe a small cap fund or a value fund. But to really get some true diversification there is very important. And then we do want you to reallocate annually. So just because you set something doesn't mean it's going to stay in those percentages forever. As things do better or worse over time, your percentages will shift. And so it will not necessarily stay in the balance that you want. And so doing that annual reallocation back to your target percentages and just sitting down and taking a look at how you're allocated to make sure it still matches your goals is important. The last thing on this slide that we do want to mention is it's very important to roll over assets to either an IRA or to your new jobs retirement plan when you leave an employer. Sometimes there are reasons not to, but you don't want to, if people change jobs, quite a few times during a career, most of the time these days. And so you don't want to end up with 5 or 6 old 401ks. They can be hard to keep track of. They're hard to keep allocated the way you want them. It's hard to manage costs. There's a bunch of reasons. And so it's a best practice that when you leave an employer that you go ahead and roll that money over to, unless there's a very specific reason for keeping the money in that employer plan. And so the mistakes that we want you to avoid: failing to participate, borrowing from the plan. This is not always a mistake, but usually it is a mistake, because when you take the money out, even though you're paying yourself interest, you may not be accumulating as much as you would if you just left the money in. And then oftentimes, if you end up leaving the employer during this time, you have to pay a 10% penalty because it's just considered a distribution plus income taxes. And so we really want you to think about the money that goes into a 401k or 403b or 457 plan is just gone from you until you're retired and ready to start using it. Cashing out early is another thing that is generally a mistake. The time value of money is really huge. And so when you start saving in your 20s and 30s, if you just leave that money alone and let it grow without taking it out, you will have so much more when you get into your 50s and 60s and are ready to start using it. And so pulling it out prematurely just short circuits that and makes you start over again. And then we've talked about diversification. So that's another important mistake to avoid. And then the last couple of bullets here we haven't talked about. So ignoring costs. So when you're selecting your investment choices in your plan, you would think that historical performance is the best predictor of future performance. It's not. Morningstar did a study a few years back that talks about cost, which is the expense ratio of the investment option, as the best predictor of future performance, which seems illogical. It seems like you should be able to look at the prior performance and it would predict, but it just doesn't. And so we really encourage you, when you're trying to look at those US stock funds and pick the one that you want, is look for what their expense ratios are. And unless there's a really good reason not to go with the one with the lowest expense ratio, that's the one you want to use for that category. It's usually an index fund. And that's a really good way to also kind of steer yourself in the right direction. And then the last bullet is timing the market. And this can be really tempting. And sometimes you get it right. Like you may have, if in mid-February last year, you kind of got clued into COVID stuff early, and you became concerned about it and you decided you were going to hop out of the market before the sell-off really started, you may have felt like a genius, as March came on and things got worse and worse and worse. But the reality is, unless you got back in around March 23 or 24, you actually missed out on a really great year of returns if you didn't stay invested through the COVID sell-off and then the recovery and then the subsequent growth. And so timing the market is not usually an effective pursuit, because you have to make two right decisions. It's when to get out and when to get back in. And investment professionals, that this is their job. They try to do it, but most of them don't get it right either. And so I would just encourage you not to try. Just recognize that there are going to be ups and downs in the market, and it's okay. You don't have to never lose a dime to be successful as an investor. You can have your money go up and down. The general direction is still going to be up. And so that can still be a very effective investment strategy. In fact, it's more effective usually than trying to time the market. You usually end up hurting yourself more than helping. So let's just talk about a few of the rules of tax deferred plans, so we can contrast those with other types of plans. So when you put money into a tax deferred plan, you get a tax break, meaning that if you put $100 from your paycheck in, it doesn't reduce your paycheck by $100. It might reduce it by $80 because you're getting a tax benefit from doing that. But then the second part of this is very important to be aware of, is that all the money you put in, plus everything it earns, gets taxed at your regular income tax rate when you withdraw. And so the contribution limits do vary by type of plan. We talked about the $19,500 as the limit for 401ks, 403bs, and 457 plans. And there are withdrawal rules. And so you can't take money out before you're 59 and a half, and you have to start taking withdrawals at 72. So between 59 and a half and 72, it is optional. The reason we say usually is if you're still employed by the same employer whose retirement plan it is, at 72, you don't have to start taking distributions yet. So that is a nice exception to that rule. Now let's compare traditional and Roth. So traditional, and you can add 457 plan to this. You can also do Roth 457. Pre-tax dollars go in. Earnings are tax deferred. Withdrawals are taxed at regular rates. Roth, you use post-tax dollars, meaning that if you put a Roth contribution in through your paycheck or through a Roth IRA and you put $100 in, it's going to reduce your paycheck by $100. So it's just a 1-for-1. But the earnings are tax-free if you follow the rules, and withdrawals are not taxed if you follow the rules. And the rules are primarily waiting until you're 59 and a half to start drawing from it. And in the case of a Roth IRA, having had the Roth IRA for at least 5 years. So there are different withdrawal rules depending on whether it's a Roth IRA or a Roth employer plan. And so if you have Roth money in an employer plan, it's actually your required minimum distributions at age 72 are still required. But with a Roth IRA, there are no required minimum distributions. You can keep that money in there your entire life and pass it on to your kids if you want to. And so it's very beneficial and important when you have money in Roth in your employer plan, that when you leave the employer, that you roll it over to a Roth IRA to avoid those required minimum distributions. Okay, and so here we have just general ways to make the most out of your IRAs. And so we want you to contribute as much as you can if it's a deductible IRA or Roth. And we talked about why you wouldn't want to do a non-deductible IRA. We want you to diversify broadly and rebalance annually. We do want you to consider a Roth IRA for new contributions. And then you can also consider converting existing IRAs, 401ks, and 403bs to Roth. So this is an interesting option because you pay taxes when you do this, and each conversion has a new 5-year holding period before the earnings become tax-free. but it can be a really great way to get more money into Roth and have more tax diversification in retirement. So it's just something we want you to be aware of as an option. There are no income limits on converting to Roth. And then let's talk a little bit more about taxable investments. So we already mentioned this earlier, but there are no contribution limits or withdrawal rules. You are free to make any investments. It's a great way to diversify your portfolio, to have another option for income in retirement. And then earnings are taxed at lower than regular rates. And so our regular tax rates are 10%, 12%, 22%, 24%, and then they go up into the 30s. Capital gains actually have a 0% long-term capital gain rate, where long-term is considered if you've held it for more than a year. And you can, if your income is in that 10 or 12% tax bracket, you can sell things you've owned long-term and pay no tax on it. So you get that option. And then if you have a little bit more income, it's a 15% capital gain rate. And then if you get up above $250,000 for a married couple, you actually pay 18.8% because you get into some extra Medicare taxes, but still lower than your regular income tax rates. So that's something that gives you a lot more flexibility with retirement planning. And then we do want you to review your allocation annually for all these types of accounts. So look at the big picture, look at all your different accounts. Consider, if you're getting into your 50s and 60s, shifting to a more conservative portfolio. And then no matter what age, continuing to invest for some growth. So keeping some stock in your portfolio. So we do want to allow time for questions here, but I do want to just talk a little bit about how to create that retirement income strategy for those of you that are getting close and really thinking about this aspect of it. And so the first thing that we want you to be aware of is to keep 2 years of planned portfolio withdrawals in cash. And so, say you're going to be drawing $2,000 a month from your investments. That would mean that you want to have about $48,000 that's sitting in money market or cash in your investment accounts to be drawn from. The reason for that is if we have a big market downturn, you don't want to have to sell your investments while they're down. And if we, it just gives you more flexibility to be able to handle that. It also kind of removes a lot of the worry if you know where your investment income is coming from. And then we also want you to replenish this. So say you start the retirement with 2 years in cash, and then you spend the first year. At the end of that year, you'll have 1 year left, right? You'd have $24,000 in cash. And so if everything is kind of going smoothly with the markets, you would just replenish and go back to 2 years. But if things are a little bit more volatile and things are down, you have the option to wait. And so that 2 years of planned portfolio withdrawals is important. The next thing we want you to consider is delaying Social Security. And you can delay as late as age 70. You do not need to time your retirement with Social Security. They can be two separate events. You can self-fund more of your retirement early on by pulling more from your portfolio to get the higher Social Security benefit. It goes up by 8% per year. And so this is a whole topic that we can spend a whole session on, is Social Security timing and strategies. So if I did, just want to put that bug in your ear. The next thing is to plan for taxes. And so sometimes retirees make the mistake that in your 60s, you can have an extremely low tax burden. If you haven't started your Social Security yet, and you don't have your required minimum distributions from your retirement accounts, you can pay no taxes. And people get so excited about this, they love it. But there's no free lunch. You will be paying taxes later on when you get into your 70s, and you have to start your required minimum distributions, and you have to start your Social Security. And so by paying a small amount of taxes in your 60s, you can reduce your taxes later on. So we really want to emphasize the benefit of planning in that potentially low tax decade to reduce your taxes in the future. And then you also need to make sure you take required withdrawals from employer plans and IRAs. Maintaining a sustainable total withdrawal rate is important as well. It is okay. You may have heard of the 4% safe withdrawal rule, and that's where you will, if you just draw 4% from your investments each year, you can reasonably expect them to last about 30 years. it's okay if you're delaying your Social Security to take more early on to fund that Social Security delay. So when we talk about a sustainable total withdrawal rate, there can be some flex there. It doesn't need to be exactly 4% every year. It can be higher some years and lower other years. And that's where working with a financial planner can really help you pinpoint and project how much you can safely take from your portfolio. And then I want to let you know you should expect to spend principal some years. And so there will be years where the market is down and you've got your cash that you're taking out that you've set aside. And so the net result is you're spending principal because the rest of your portfolio isn't growing in that year. And that's okay. You want to know that there's going to be ups and downs and that the market will go up more often than it goes down. But if you have some years where you're dipping into principal, you can still have an extremely sustainable financial plan. It's not something that you need to just avoid at all costs. And then maintaining an emergency fund is just something we want you to be aware of, no matter what age you are. But it does continue into retirement, that you want to keep money available in case of unexpected expenses. The thing that changes in retirement is you don't have to worry about losing your job, right? That is done. So instead of setting your goal based on 3 to 6 months of living expenses like you do when you're working, you would want to set your emergency fund goal based on thinking about probably the 2 or 3 biggest things that could go wrong, like the combination of most likely issues. If they all happen at once, how much money would you need? And so, it could be a car accident, it could be medical things, it could be your HVAC goes out, all of those things that can happen. And so if you have enough to handle 2 or 3 of those at once, then you've got a really good cushion to get you through that. And then we want you just to make sure that you're considering these other things: long-term care, wills, powers of attorney, medical documents, and inheritance taxes. And note that inheritance taxes right now, most of us don't need to worry about them. The limit is $11 million per person. And so that's a problem we probably all wish we had, to worry about inheritance taxes, but it's not something that most of us need to focus on at this point. And Texas does not have a state-specific inheritance tax, so it's just the federal. All right. And then if you want help, you can go to the Financial Planning Association's website, plannersearch.org, and search based on location and also fee approach, asset minimums, last name. They also give you a list of questions to ask a financial planner. So, Jennifer, I think we covered everything. I didn't leave quite 15 minutes, but pretty close.
Okay, it's a lot. We do have questions. It's a lot of information. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so that we can both be on? All right. So we got a couple of questions before via email. So I'm going to start with those, and then I'll get to the ones in the chat. So the first one is, how does retirement affect taxes at the end of the year of retirement and thereafter?
Yeah. So when you are retired, so when you're working, you're going to still have your taxes withheld from your paycheck. When you retire, it really depends on where your income is coming from. So with a pension, taxes will be withheld from that, and you have some control over how much is withheld. If you are taking money from an IRA or from a 457 plan that was pre-tax, all of that is going to be regular income. If you have your drop account, and I'm speaking to City of Fort Worth employees here, that you perhaps rolled to an IRA, all that's going to be taxed as regular income. And so you can have taxes withheld on that as it comes out. And so our tax system is graduated. So the more income you have, the higher the marginal tax rate is. So it doesn't make the first dollars of income you have taxed at a higher rate, but it does make this later dollars taxed at a higher rate. And so you just want to be cognizant of what your total income is and make sure that you're having enough withheld to cover that. It can be really helpful to work with a financial planner or a tax preparer to make sure you're in the right ballpark early in retirement, because you don't know initially and you don't want to have an unpleasant surprise.
All right, let's see. I have worked in the private sector prior to joining the city. I'm wondering how to calculate the difference in Social Security earnings and the city's pension fund.
Right. That's a great question. So if you have earnings from Social Security and from a city pension, you will be subject to the windfall elimination provision. So what that means is that if you get your Social Security statement and it's showing that you're entitled to a certain benefit, you need to subtract from it that windfall elimination provision amount that is going to be down kind of on that same page as they're showing all the benefits kind of in the bottom half of the page. And it's $400 and some per month. And so if it says you're entitled to $1,200, you're going to get $750. And so you are eligible for both of those. And so that's a common misconception that people think, oh, I'm not really going to get any of this Social Security. It's not true. If you have earned a Social Security benefit, you can receive it. It's just going to have that offset in there. And you still want to consider delaying. That can still be a very effective tool for you.
Okay, let me get in here. All right, so one of the questions we've actually been asked a lot is they can tell we're recording and where do they go afterwards to watch the recording. So we will post the recording of this program to the library's YouTube page. It usually takes about a week or so for it to show up. But if you just go to YouTube and you search Fort Worth Public Library, you'll find our page. And then we have a playlist of all of our adult programs. So it will show in that playlist. All right, next question. Recommendations on where to begin to get an estate plan.
Yeah. So you generally want to work with an attorney on this. And so most attorneys will offer a will package, and that would include, all the documents that I mentioned. Some you can, as a stopgap, use online services like LegalZoom. I know a lot of people do that. That is better than nothing, but it's not really the same as sitting down with an attorney and having them actually explain everything to you. There are also services where you join kind of like the legal services, you pay like a monthly subscription, and those will usually include estate planning documents as well. And that can actually be a great deal if you pay for the monthly subscription, get your estate planning documents, and then you can terminate the service. And so, if you don't feel like you have an ongoing need for it. And so any of those options is great.
Right. I am currently drawing my late husband's Social Security benefits and still work part-time. Should I continue to draw his benefits and wait until around 70 to then draw mine? Or should I go ahead and apply when I reach retirement age?
Yeah. So that's going to be very specific based on the situation, but some general guidance on that is if your benefits at age 70 are going to be higher than what you're receiving from your deceased spouses, then it is usually better to wait all the way till age 70 to switch to your own benefit, because essentially your benefit is just still continuing to grow at no cost to you while you're receiving these other benefits from your deceased spouse. So that's not always 100% of the time the right thing to do, but it's usually the right thing to do.
Let's see. And that is all our questions.
Oh, awesome.
All right. So any last bits of advice you want to give us?
So I've just really enjoyed doing this with you. It's kind of a whirlwind tour of retirement planning. And so hopefully everyone got some valuable information from it. And I guess my encouragement to you would be, if this felt a little overwhelming, which I can imagine how it would, that you don't want to just kind of set it aside. You still want to think about your specific situation and think about what you need to do next. And going back to that chart, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s chart is a really good, kind of guidance point to think about what's important for you to be focusing on at this point in your life.
Great. So I want to thank you for doing this presentation today. And I want to thank everybody who attended. I hope that you gathered some good information for you to get started with your plan. If you're participating in our Mayor's Summer Reading Challenge, you can get credit for attending this program by entering the code FINANCE into the Beanstack app. If you aren't participating, I encourage you to sign up. You can do so by either visiting our website, fortworthlibrary.org, or downloading the Beanstack, and that's BEANSTACK app on your mobile device. And we have some great Business Equity Week programs coming up the 21st through the 25th. We hope you can find some time to join those, and you can find more information on our programs by visiting our website. So thank you very much. Everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Jennifer.